Sit across the table from someone who came of age before the internet reshaped human consciousness, and you will notice something unsettling in the quality of exchange. They hold eye contact without flinching toward a pocket vibration. Their sentences unfold with architectural precision, building thought upon thought until a complete idea stands before you. When you speak, they absorb your words with a patience that feels almost archaeological in its rarity, as if listening were still a skill worth cultivating rather than an inconvenience to be endured between notifications. Now observe the typical interaction among those born into the age of infinite scroll. Attention fractures every few moments. Responses arrive not as considered reflections, but as reflexive reactions, often compressed into pictographic shorthand that substitutes emotional signaling for actual emotional engagement. Conversations do not build or deepen. They flicker and jump, mirroring the very interfaces that have colonized these minds since adolescence. The contrast between these two modes of human connection should disturb us more than it does. We have undergone a transformation so gradual that most people registering its effects mistake the symptoms for normalcy. What previous generations cultivated as intellectual virtue, we have reframed as cognitive burden. The sustained focus required to navigate a complex argument now registers as punishment rather than pleasure. Reading deeply feels like swimming against a current that grows stronger each year. Even disagreement, that ancient art of testing ideas against one another, demands an expenditure of mental energy that fewer people seem willing or able to muster. This is not mere generational complaint, or the familiar refrain that each era produces softer versions of its predecessor. Something structural has shifted in how human beings allocate and sustain attention. We have struck a devil's bargain, trading the slow accumulation of knowledge for the instant gratification of information snippets. We have swapped cultural depth for viral velocity, intellectual development for dopamine hits delivered with pharmaceutical precision. The tragedy compounds when you realize how few people recognize the exchange has even occurred. They believe themselves modern, adapted, efficiently processing the fire hose of content that streams past them daily. They do not see the slow starvation of capacities that took generations to build. This is not evolution. This is atrophy with a progress narrative attached to it. We are living through an epidemic of cognitive diminishment that operates in silence, precisely because its victims have lost the very faculties needed to perceive their own decline. The year that everything accelerated also marked the moment when everything flattened. 2016 did not announce itself as a watershed. No alarms sounded. No warnings were issued. Yet in retrospect, we can identify that year as the point where certain trajectories that had been building finally achieved critical mass and began reshaping human consciousness at scale. The platform that would come to define fragmented attention exploded into global awareness, perfecting a formula for capturing and redistributing focus in 10-second intervals. Other established networks, sensing the shift, renovated their own architectures to match this new velocity. What had begun as digital scrapbooks transformed into meticulously engineered attention traps. Stories that vanished after viewing. Videos that played without permission. Content feeds that scrolled infinitely downward, exploiting the same neural pathways that once kept our ancestors alert to movement in tall grass. The entire ecosystem restructured itself around a single imperative: do not let the user look away. Nothing in these systems emerged from innocent experimentation. Every element that captures your focus underwent rigorous testing and refinement. The endless feed that never concludes trains your brain to expect perpetual novelty. The autoplay mechanism removes the friction of choice, letting consumption become passive and therefore endless. The full-screen format eliminates peripheral awareness, creating tunnel vision on demand. The heart icon positioned exactly where your thumb naturally rests transforms approval into an effortless gesture, repeated hundreds of times daily until it becomes automatic as breathing. These refinements did not emerge from user requests or organic evolution. They are the product of systematic psychological research applied toward commercial ends. Companies discovered that if they could deliver rapid bursts of visual and auditory pleasure on an unpredictable schedule, they could create behavioral patterns indistinguishable from addiction. Laboratory rats eventually disengage from levers that no longer deliver rewards. Human beings, it turns out, possess less self-protective instinct. We continue pulling the lever long after it stops serving any purpose beyond the pull itself. Each clip you watch triggers a small neurochemical release. Your brain receives its reward and immediately begins anticipating the next one. But the mechanism contains a cruel mathematics. The more frequently you stimulate these pathways, the less satisfaction each individual hit provides. Activities that once brought genuine pleasure, reading a chapter, watching a sunset without photographing it, holding a conversation without monitoring your device, begin registering as insufficient. They lack the intensity, the velocity, the constant stimulation that your recalibrated nervous system now requires just to feel baseline normal. This is not merely about entertainment or leisure time mismanagement. The effects penetrate deeper, altering fundamental cognitive capacities. Your ability to generate original thoughts, to hold multiple ideas in working memory long enough to perceive their relationships, to sustain concentration on a single demanding task. All of these executive functions degrade under the weight of perpetual distraction. You have surely experienced the sensation of reading a page only to reach the bottom and realize you absorbed nothing. You have felt the compulsion to check your phone during a task that requires perhaps 5 minutes of unbroken focus. This is not personal weakness or failure of discipline. This is the intended outcome of systems designed to fragment your attention into commercially exploitable units. The data emerging from cognitive research should alarm us more than it does. Since that pivotal year, measured intelligence in developed nations has begun declining for the first time in the modern era. Each successive cohort demonstrates weaker performance across multiple domains: logical reasoning, reading comprehension, working memory, sustained attention. We are not discussing minor fluctuations or statistical noise. Young people born after the mid-90s score 7 points lower on standardized assessments than their parents did at the same age. 7 points represents the gap between following a nuanced argument and losing the thread entirely. It is the difference between synthesis and confusion. There existed a period, not distant in historical terms, yet feeling almost mythological in character, when human minds operated under fundamentally different conditions. The decade of the 1970s witnessed what researchers now recognize as one of the highest peaks in measured human intelligence. This was not the result of superior genetics or evolutionary advantage. Rather, it emerged from a precise alignment between cultural practices, educational approaches, and environmental conditions that together created an ideal incubator for cognitive development. Enter a classroom from that era, and you would find a reverence for intellectual authority that needed no enforcement through volume or intimidation. Teachers commanded attention through substance rather than spectacle. Students arrived equipped with notebooks and the expectation that their role involved active listening, careful transcription, and genuine reflection on material presented. The pedagogy did not soften concepts to make them palatable. It demanded rigor. It challenged students to stretch toward complexity rather than reducing complexity to meet students where they happened to be standing. Those who successfully navigated these demands gained something far more valuable than factual knowledge. They developed autonomous thinking, the capacity to examine ideas without requiring external validation at each step, to hold uncertainty in mind while working toward resolution, to build arguments from foundation to conclusion without losing structural integrity along the way. This kind of cognitive sovereignty cannot be downloaded or acquired through exposure. It must be built through repeated practice under conditions that reward depth over speed. Books in that era functioned not merely as educational tools, but as portals into fully realized worlds. Young people encountered Camus and Nietzsche not as intimidating relics, but as living conversations they could enter. They read novels that demanded hundreds of pages of sustained attention, following character development that unfolded slowly, absorbing prose that required active interpretation rather than passive consumption. The pace of reading matched the pace of thought. There was no algorithmic pressure to reach the conclusion quickly, no anxiety about the ending, no compulsion to skip ahead for a summary that would eliminate the need for actual engagement. The pleasure resided in the process itself, in watching ideas develop across chapters, in discovering connections that only became visible through patient accumulation of detail. A 15-year-old from this period could recite Shakespeare with comprehension, could work through algebraic problems by understanding the underlying logic rather than memorizing formulas. Today, we produce young people who cannot interpret a straightforward paragraph without outsourcing comprehension to artificial intelligence. This is not arrogance. This is documentable reality captured in countless assessments that show declining literacy and numeracy across developed nations. Cultural transmission operated differently when information scarcity forced selectivity and depth. Magazines dedicated entire issues to single topics, expecting readers to spend hours with one subject rather than minutes with dozens. Sunday newspapers published essays that ran thousands of words, assuming an audience with both the attention span and intellectual appetite to digest substantial arguments. Radio programs featured interviews that lasted the better part of an hour, during which ideas could be properly developed, challenged, and refined through dialogue. No frantic editing, no background music manipulating emotional response, no visual gimmicks compensating for weak content. Just voice and text, substance without decoration, ideas presented clearly enough that they could stand on their own merits. And people engaged with this material. They read these essays. They listened to these interviews. They thought about what they had consumed. Then they discussed it with others who had also invested the time and attention required for genuine comprehension. Imagine proposing such a format today. A 40-minute television interview with a philosopher exploring questions of meaning and existence. No cuts every few seconds, no dramatic music, no visual stimulation beyond two people talking. The contemporary response would be immediate dismissal. Too slow, too demanding, too boring. Yet in the 70s, this represented standard programming, not niche content for specialists, but mainstream engagement with serious ideas. The shift from that world to ours reveals not just changing preferences, but a fundamental alteration in what minds can and will tolerate. Perhaps most striking was the relationship that era maintained with silence. Quiet was not an absence to be filled, but a presence to be inhabited. People sat alone with their thoughts without experiencing this as punishment or deprivation. They looked out windows during train rides. They waited in lines without pulling out devices to murder the empty moments. Silence provided the space in which reflection could occur, where ideas could settle and recombine, where boredom could do its essential work of forcing the mind to generate its own stimulation. We have lost this capacity almost entirely. Silence now triggers discomfort, even panic. We compulsively fill every gap with content, with noise, with anything that prevents us from sitting alone inside our own consciousness. We have become afraid of what we might discover in those quiet moments, or perhaps more accurately, afraid of discovering nothing at all, just a restless emptiness that has forgotten how to be still. The conditions that created this golden age can be reduced to two essential elements working in concert. First, concentration became possible because it was required. You could not skim a book, or fast forward through a documentary, or half attend a lecture while monitoring other inputs. Full presence was simply the default mode of engagement. Second, scarcity paradoxically generated abundance. When external stimulation remained limited, the mind turned inward and began producing its own material. Ideas emerged from boredom. Creativity fed on the very emptiness we now frantically avoid. Before the internet provided instant access to infinite content, imagination filled the void. Children created elaborate games from simple materials. Adults developed hobbies that required patient skill acquisition. Thinkers generated original insights because they spent long hours with their own thoughts rather than constantly consuming the thoughts of others. The boredom we now treat as enemy was actually fertile ground from which innovation and artistry grew. From this soil emerged the architects of our modern world. The scientists and engineers who developed the technologies we now use daily received their education during this period when logic, rhetoric, and historical analysis were taught with genuine depth rather than superficial coverage. They learned to think systematically, to build knowledge structures that could support complex reasoning, to persist through difficulty rather than seeking the path of least resistance. The gap between that generation and ours is not subtle or debatable. They read 30 books annually on average. We read fewer than 2. They wrote letters, diaries, extended essays that required organizing thoughts into coherent sequences. We communicate through emoji strings, acronyms, and auto-generated responses that eliminate the need for original composition. They developed ideas slowly through conversation and correspondence. We perform reactions for an audience that we hope is watching, but that we know is simultaneously performing for their own audiences in an infinite regression of superficial display. The transition from the analog era to digital immersion did not happen overnight, but it accelerated with devastating speed once certain technological and social thresholds were crossed. If the 80s and 90s served as a warming period, the opening years of the new millennium brought a fundamental restructuring of how human attention operates in the world. The internet evolved from novelty to necessity, from tool to environment, from something we used to something we inhabited. Our minds did not so much adopt new technology as become colonized by it. The promise accompanying these technologies sounded magnificent. All human knowledge accessible instantly. Connection to anyone, anywhere. The world's information organized and searchable. Democracy amplified through universal voice. But promises and outcomes rarely align when powerful incentives enter the equation. The more access we gained, the less depth we maintained. Before these platforms, acquiring knowledge required effort. You had to seek, question, investigate, synthesize. Now everything arrives pre-processed, simplified, compressed into formats designed for maximum velocity and minimum friction. Our minds were thrust into this new environment without preparation or protection. Imagine being dropped into an ocean with unlimited water in every direction, but no method for determining which water is safe to drink, no map showing where you are, no compass indicating direction. This is the cognitive situation we inhabit. Drowning in information while starving for understanding, surrounded by content while isolated from meaning, constantly connected yet perpetually alone. The platforms themselves evolved with predatory efficiency. Early social networks gave way to more sophisticated versions that learned from every interaction, refining their grip on attention with each software update. Messaging services transformed from simple text exchange into multimedia streams demanding constant monitoring. By 2015, research showed that the average adult attention span had collapsed to 8 seconds. 8 seconds. Less than the attention span attributed to goldfish, creatures operating with nervous systems far simpler than our own. This is not hyperbole or exaggeration designed to provoke. This is measured reality. The human animal, capable of creating symphonies and sending probes to distant planets, now focuses on individual tasks for less time than a fish circling a bowl. The cause is not mysterious. These platforms were never designed to inform or enlighten. They were architected to capture and monetize attention at industrial scale. Your focus became the product being harvested and sold. Every moment you spend looking at a screen generates revenue for someone else. To maximize that revenue, platforms needed to maximize your screen time. Thus emerged the psychological casino you carry everywhere. Infinite feeds that never conclude, training you to scroll just a little more, always hoping the next post will deliver the satisfaction the previous 100 failed to provide. Videos that begin playing without your permission, removing the small moment of choice that might break the consumption cycle. Notifications engineered to trigger curiosity and anxiety simultaneously, ensuring you cannot resist checking even when you know nothing important awaits. Colors selected for maximum visual impact. Sounds tuned to penetrate ambient noise and grab attention. Every detail refined through endless testing to exploit the vulnerabilities in human neurology. During this period, educators and researchers began documenting alarming declines in cognitive performance. Students scored progressively worse on assessments measuring reading comprehension, logical reasoning, and analytical thinking. The brain began operating in what scientists term continuous partial attention, a state where you are never fully present in any single activity. You are always monitoring multiple streams, always prepared to shift focus, always superficially engaged with everything and deeply engaged with nothing. Consider your own experience with this phenomenon. You start reading an article that interests you, something substantial that requires thought. Before completing the first section, your hand reaches for your device to check for messages that almost certainly do not exist. You return to the article, read another paragraph, then feel compelled to verify something mentioned in the text, which leads to 3 more browser tabs, none of which you fully examine. You glance at social media feeds, watch half of a video, remember you are reading something, return to find you have forgotten the context entirely. This is not personal failure. This is the designed outcome of systems that profit from fragmentation. The business model achieved clarity during this era. More time spent staring at screens equals more opportunities to serve advertisements equals more revenue extracted from your attention. To achieve this, technology companies invested heavily in understanding how to make their products addictive. They studied variable reward schedules, the same mechanisms that make gambling compulsive. They employed intermittent reinforcement, ensuring you never know when checking will deliver something valuable, which paradoxically makes checking more compulsive than if rewards arrived on a predictable schedule. They weaponized dopamine, an ancient neurotransmitter meant to reward behaviors essential for survival, repurposing it to reward behaviors that generate shareholder value. Content itself degraded in response to these incentives. Deep learning required time that users no longer possessed or platforms no longer valued. Information became performance, optimized for shares rather than truth, for emotional reaction rather than intellectual engagement. Videos shortened relentlessly. Text simplified into lists and bullet points. Every piece of content was repackaged as either outrage fuel or empty inspiration, the 2 emotional registers that generate maximum engagement. The goal was never to inform, but to hook, to keep you scrolling, clicking, watching, reacting forever. The consequences extend beyond mere distraction. We are creating a generation with anxious, accelerated minds incapable of sustaining linear thought. Young people jump between topics without developing any single idea to completion. Adults cannot maintain conversations without compulsively checking devices, as if something crucial might be happening elsewhere, as if the present moment and present company deserve only partial presence. Professionals read complex documents as if they were social media posts, skimming for key phrases while missing the arguments that give those phrases meaning. Then we compound the problem by reframing it as virtue. We call this multitasking, as if it represents evolved capability rather than degraded function. The human brain cannot actually perform multiple complex cognitive tasks simultaneously. What we experience as multitasking is rapid switching between tasks, each switch carrying a cognitive cost, each transition leaving residue that impairs performance on the next task. What feels like efficiency is actually just stress wearing a productivity costume. What looks like capability is frequently just exhaustion we have stopped recognizing as abnormal. We must now confront a truth that many will find uncomfortable and some will reject entirely. What has happened to human attention and cognition over the past 2 decades was not accidental. It was not the inevitable byproduct of technological progress. You were manipulated. We were all manipulated by entities that discovered how to transform human consciousness into profit and who built empires on that discovery. They learned to exploit the architecture of your brain with the same precision that earlier industries learned to exploit natural resources. And they did so while convincing you that the resulting dependency represented freedom, connection, and progress. This manipulation succeeded so completely because it aligned commercial incentives with powerful psychological vulnerabilities. Your brain evolved over millions of years to notice novelty, to seek social connection, to respond to uncertainty with heightened attention. These were survival mechanisms in environments where vigilance meant the difference between eating and being eaten. But in a digital environment, these same mechanisms become liabilities. They make you refresh feeds compulsively, check notifications reflexively, scroll endlessly through content that provides diminishing returns with each passing hour. The very traits that kept your ancestors alive now keep you captured. The companies behind these platforms employed teams of psychologists, neuroscientists, and engineers whose sole purpose was making their products inescapable. They studied how to create dependency, how to generate anxiety around disconnection, how to ensure that being away from their platforms felt like missing out on something essential. They then deployed these findings at global scale, running what amounts to the largest unregulated psychological experiment in human history. And they succeeded beyond perhaps even their own projections. They created a world where people feel genuine distress when separated from devices where the average person checks their phone over 100 times daily, where teenagers experience measurable anxiety if prevented from accessing social media for even brief periods. This is the uncomfortable portrait of our current reality. In merely 2 decades, we transitioned from a culture that valued sustained thought to one that cannot tolerate even momentary boredom. We traded the deep satisfaction of reading for the shallow stimulation of scrolling. We exchanged genuine expertise for the performance of intelligence, preferring to appear knowledgeable rather than undertaking the difficult work of actually becoming knowledgeable. And perhaps most devastating, we normalized this transformation so completely that suggesting something might be wrong now sounds like nostalgia or technophobia rather than legitimate concern about measurable cognitive decline. The generation that came of age in the 70s, with a fraction of our technological resources, thought with greater clarity, felt with greater depth, and engaged with ideas more rigorously than we do surrounded by unlimited information. They read books that demanded patience. They wrote letters that required organizing thoughts into coherent form. They had conversations that built ideas collaboratively rather than competitively. Meanwhile, we struggle to complete paragraphs, communicate in fragmented abbreviations, and mistake reaction for reflection. The comparison is not flattering. The comparison is humiliating. But the comparison is also necessary because recognizing the problem represents the first step toward addressing it. Here is the crucial element that transforms this from depressing diagnosis to actionable opportunity. What distraction has damaged, discipline can rebuild. The human brain possesses remarkable plasticity, the ability to reorganize itself in response to how you use it. The same neurological flexibility that allowed these platforms to reshape your attention can be harnessed to restore capacities you thought were permanently lost. You can reclaim sovereignty over your own consciousness. The process will not be easy, and it will not be fast, but it is entirely possible if you commit to it with the same intentionality that technology companies applied to capturing your attention in the first place. Begin with small, concrete actions rather than overwhelming yourself with complete transformation. Identify the single application that consumes the most time while providing the least value, and remove it from your device entirely. Not hiding it in a folder, not setting time limits you will ignore, but deleting it completely. Feel the discomfort that follows. Notice how often your hand reaches for your phone to access something that is no longer there. This discomfort is withdrawal, and like all withdrawal, it indicates you are breaking a dependency that was controlling you. Reintroduce reading as a daily practice, but start with realistic expectations. One page fully absorbed is worth more than a chapter skimmed, while your attention fragments across multiple inputs. Read that page with complete presence. Notice when your mind wanders, or when you feel the compulsion to check your device. Acknowledge these impulses without judgment, then gently return your attention to the text. Over time, one page becomes 2, then 5, then entire chapters consumed with the kind of deep focus you thought you had lost forever. Practice having conversations where your phone remains, not just silent, but physically absent from the interaction. Initially, this will feel strange, even anxiety-inducing. You have been conditioned to treat device access as essential as oxygen, so removing it temporarily triggers discomfort, similar to holding your breath. But as you sit with another human being and give them your complete attention, something remarkable happens. The conversation deepens. Ideas develop more fully. Connection becomes genuine rather than performed. You remember what human interaction felt like before it became mediated through screens and curated for invisible audiences. Most radically, you must rescue boredom from its current status as enemy to be eliminated. Boredom is not dead time to be filled with content. It is fertile soil from which creativity grows. When you feel boredom approaching, resist the immediate impulse to reach for distraction. Sit with the discomfort. Let your mind wander without direction or purpose. This is where unexpected connections form, where original ideas emerge, where you rediscover the capacity for thought that does not simply react to external stimuli, but generates something new from internal resources. Think of this process as rebuilding a temple that was allowed to fall into ruin. You would not approach such a task casually or quickly. You would work with patience, with respect for what the structure once represented, with attention to detail and commitment to restoration rather than mere renovation. Your mind deserves the same reverence, the same careful reconstruction, the same refusal to accept diminished function as permanent condition. What we are losing extends beyond the ability to concentrate or remember or think clearly, though these losses alone would justify concern. We are losing the capacity to live with depth in a world that grows more shallow by the day. We are losing autonomy over our own attention, which means we are losing autonomy over our own lives, since what you pay attention to ultimately determines who you become. We are losing the very essence of what makes human consciousness remarkable, the ability to reflect, to consider, to hold complexity without collapsing it into simplistic reaction. This deterioration must stop. It must stop with you, now, today, in whatever small way you can manage. The future of human cognition, human connection, and human meaning depends on individuals deciding that they will no longer participate in their own diminishment. Reality does not accommodate those who ignore it. The consequences of continued distraction will not magically resolve themselves. The choice confronts you directly. Continue allowing your attention to be harvested and sold, or begin the difficult work of reclaiming what was taken. Are you ready to reclaim your mind? The question is not rhetorical. The answer will be demonstrated, not through words, but through action, through the choices you make in the next hour, the next day, the rest of your life. Begin now. Begin small. But begin.